just get people to move forward because then the people in the back.
I'm going to request people in the back row to come forward. I know the air conditioning is strategic there, but people. No movement. It's fine. Exactly. Brilliant. Thank you very much for staying for what hopefully should be a short and hopefully interesting panel for you. I have the entire steering committee from the Education Development Impact Bond in this room or in the panel. So if we can't answer some questions, we also have colleagues from Tata, Dalberg, and other wider colleagues, service providers as well, I think a few of them. The first panel made a real case for working in government schools, working in areas like education, working in partnership, not doing small research pilots, focusing on measurements and using metrics. I'm really proud to say that we're doing all of that. And what we can offer you is some real learning from doing it practically, doing it, learning while doing it, and also being able to share failures, successes, early learnings. It's been a brilliant journey together collectively. This is a partnership. I was looking at the number of people who are working together. I'm going to, if I can, move that to that. It doesn't work when you need it to. I'm going to wait. Fine. It's the third slide.
Use the old school.
Okay. Brilliant. Technology doesn't work, which is why we only have one EdTech partner on the DIB. So we just, because we genuinely believe human beings do it better. So I'm going to quickly introduce my panel, tell you what we're going to be doing. I'm going to keep it short and sweet from my end. I've got Gaurav here from Dalberg. They are the performance managers on our DIB. They really have been working on the ground with the service providers on really looking at how outcomes can be linked to performance and enabling this DIB to function on the ground. He's going to give you some understanding of the results of the field and what they've learned during this year. Dhan from UBS Optimus, the really pioneering investors on all the 3 DIBs in India. So you can ask her questions not just about this DIB, but on any other DIB. She'll also give you some sense of what being an investor on these programs look like. So if you're considering that role, you should get a lot of insight from Dhan. I've got Vikas representing MSDF, the anchor funder on this DIB. Really, like Geeta said, they take risk, they enable change to happen, and I would say them coming on board with 40% of the funding really enabled this partnership to come together. We need more bold people like MSDF, and Vikas will talk to you about how they're market making in India, so another very different perspective. And then here's Soumya, the person we've talked about quite a lot this morning, metrics, measurement, outcomes frameworks, things that normally sit behind closed doors, but actually on this DIB up front, we are obsessed with measurement on this DIB, and Soumya is the person who's going to talk to you about it. I try and understand some of the things she says, but she's going to make it really simple, she's promised me. Or you can put up your hand and say, Soumya, demystify that for me. So that's my panel. Very quickly, what we're going to do, if this works.
No.
I'm pressing the right button. It's just the first slide. Oh my goodness. Yeah, it's the first slide.
How about you say the next step?
Okay, so we are looking at 3 things, to do 3 things on this panel. We're going to give you a little bit of insight into this DIB, just the mechanics of it, a summary of performance and learning from this year, and the relevance to different stakeholders in this room. So if you're an NGO, government, CSR funding or philanthropy, we're going to tell you how this might be relevant to you. And that's why we've got so many perspectives. So that's the people in this panel, and we're going to be doing that. I am not going to wait for the slides because that's taking longer than expected, but I had a slide up on all the stakeholders in this DIB because I didn't want to name them, but there are 18 different stakeholders working on this together, and we are critically coming together. I'll come back to it if it comes back. I'm going to move on to what this DIB is trying to achieve. I've got 5 things we are trying to achieve, quite ambitious. Firstly, sitting in the middle of it is improving literacy and numeracy outcomes for 200,000 children in India. So that's the absolute outcome we're focused on. The quality of education in India is the issue we're focused on. It's SDG 4, learning outcomes measured as literacy and numeracy indicators. If you could just keep going, I've moved on. That's the stake. Keep going, one more and one more. So yeah, you've lost lots of my slides. I'm happy to share them with you. So improving literacy and numeracy, outcomes for children. That is what we are absolutely obsessed with. That is one and only one indicator that this DIB measures. It doesn't have a multiplicity of indicators because we believed by staying focused, we could all align more collectively, and it has been, I think, one of the strengths of this DIB. We want to scale up successful interventions. So to achieve this, we aren't just trialing one thing. We're trialing 4 different things. And we're looking at how they work against each other so that eventually we could come with some kind of a rate card which tells you if you have an indirect model in education focusing on government schools, how does that compare in terms of value for money as against a very direct model, and how does that achieve learning outcomes? So very practically trying to sort of put those 3 coordinates together. We also want to offer a way in which you can look at the most effective form of deploying funding and hopefully be the beginning of the movement to outcome-based funding. We heard quite a bit about that, but this is a practical way in which we actually want to make it happen. That's it. I'm going to move on to the next slide, which are the 4 partners, the service providers on the ground who are delivering this program. And one thing, I must congratulate them for being open enough to do this with us, because in a DIB, their results are for everybody to see. And that being brave like that enables other people to learn from them. So really, these are front runners in India, brilliant organizations in their own right. Gaurav will talk a lot more about them. But really, these are the partners who are delivering this DIB over 4 years in India. I'm going to move on to Gaurav. Welcome, Gaurav. I hope you're on baking as much as I am. So the first question, Gaurav, you have, you've been with us from the beginning. You were part of our design team. Can you talk to us about the learnings on this DIB as a performance manager in year 1 and the things that you'd like the panel to know?
Thanks, Abha, and I think you do much better without slides anyway. It's very, very passionate. Look, I think we started this morning talking about how impact bonds are not bonds. So it might be worth just explaining what is a performance manager, because we're certainly not responsible for performance. The service providers who work very hard on a day-out basis are the ones delivering performance. The role of a performance manager, and there is no set definition, but the role of a performance manager in this case at the most basic level is to actually first understand, is performance happening? Are the things that we were expecting to happen in the first quarter, the second quarter, and so forth happening? And therefore bringing a whole bunch of transparency to that process, and then raising risks ahead of time to see, well, we're probably not going to hit our performance. And where there's an opportunity to improve performance, how can we learn from each other and find those opportunities? A slightly more sophisticated version of that is actually diving in and holding the hands of service providers where needed. But I must emphasize that's a minor part, because ultimately the real performance is being driven by what the service providers have been doing day in, day out. But there is an opportunity to spot things and bring that data, handhold these organizations to improve performance. So that's us as a performance manager. Now, you've asked us what we've learned. Let me just provide some context that we have an unusual background in that we've played nearly all roles in DIBs. So whether it's actually evaluating DIBs, designing them, and now being performance manager, including one of the first ones, Educate Girls. We've seen a lot of different sort of sides of the roles that need to be played. And here's what I would say. If you're designing a DIB, then you don't want to be overworked as a consulting organization. Because if you're overworked when you're designing a DIB, it means it's too complicated and it's going to be messy. If you are evaluating a DIB, you do not want to be overworked as a consulting organization, because it means that the data is terrible and you're just trying to fill gaps and so forth. If you're a performance manager for a DIB, you should be overworked as a consulting organization, because it means the DIB is working. Because at the heart of a development impact bond, and people too often focus on the financing, is actually a confluence of sort of 4 things, right? It's this idea of, firstly, a highly engaged organization, in this case our service providers. Someone coming in and saying, I will fund you, and that runway is reasonably large and risk-taking. A real sense of what the targets are, and then the 4th thing is oversight. These 4 things, which are basically what drives performance in nearly anything, it's very hard for all 4 things to happen at the same time. And it is only when you have also oversight and people dragging you in, and in this case, some excellent service providers who actively are reaching out, wanting to listen, trying to understand where is their performance, where is it not. That actually is what drives results. it's not as much the financing. And again, if you go back to the previous DIB, if you look at something like Educate Girls, actually what's delivering impact on the ground isn't the finance. It's the fact that they have a model which taps into volunteerism. And the sustainability is not driven by sustainable finance. It's driven by mindset changes inside each of the communities. So design and execution is everything. It's not finance. And when people, for example, talk about, well, why are we spending $500,000 to deliver $500,000 of finance? That's not the point. The point is, how do we deliver excellent execution on the ground? And that's actually what is driving results. So to me, I think what is really exciting about this bond as a performance manager is to observe 3 and now 4 service providers that are actively engaging on the question on a daily basis of, hang on, are we delivering results? How can we improve those results? And that kind of transparency is often missing in the sector. Because, and I think the previous panel discussed it as well, but I would put it a bit differently. In the impact sector, we get to essentially print our own currency, right? Because impact is not defined, so we print it based on a changing set of definitions. And that actually leads to lack of discipline. It's not so much, to me, the big concern is not, this is a PR exercise. The big issue is, I think, organizationally, that if you're printing your own currency, you lack discipline. But in this bond, where the actual target is so clear, or targets, I should say, which is complex. Thanks, Abha. But the targets are very clear, and you have everyone aligned to those targets. You have people like us who are then also constantly monitoring as a performance manager. You have something very different from the status quo in most organizations, right? You have a currency that's set. There's no great inflation going on, and everyone is orienteering themselves. So I know that was a bit of a broad statement to start off with, but I just wanted to say this is the heart of why these bonds can have outsized impact, is because they can really get into helping these organizations become disciplined. And I think there's a separate question that then says, okay, will those organizations need a continuous flow of money from bonds? Will we then shift from bonds to other types of outcome payments? So I think this isn't about saying that development impact bonds are the answer to everything, but they're certainly a great starting point to get us going.
So Gaurav, you can performance manage lots of kinds of programs. So tell me about what's different about doing it in a DIB.
Well, I think actually one thing I would say is that you make it, aside from the complexity and the difficulty, which actually thankfully my colleague Gagan had to largely bear, there are some things that you have made easier for us, which again comes back to this idea of the confluence of 4 things. Often we get brought into an organization to help with performance, but it's the CEO who's excited. Or even more, it's the funder, right? The funder wants this organization to change. The organization does not want to change, and sometimes for good reason. So getting alignment on, I really want to do this, that's hard. Number 2, what exactly do you want to do? Agreement on what success looks like, extremely difficult. We spend a lot of our time on those first 2 questions. Except in a DIB, that problem is solved for. So for us, this starts to look more traditionally like some of our private sector engagements. Dalberg only engages on social impact work, but it works across different organizations. And private sector generally comes in with, I want X, deliver by this. And that makes life a lot easier because you suddenly have clients who are wanting to change and they have a very clear sense of definition. So that's what's really different about performance management in a DIB, is that some of the most difficult questions, which are about upfront framing, get solved for. Now, I know that took a year, and I know that that's hard work, and I know that that's expensive, but it's well worth it.
Brilliant. So the follow-on question from that, what do you think NGOs need to be doing to be part of DIBs? So they think they're great, they're delivering large numbers, they think they focus on outcomes. Talk to us. I have several NGO partners in the room. Tell them what they should be doing to be DIB-able or DIB-ready.
So I think because we got involved in DIBs from a very early stage, we have a DIB conversation once a week. And 90% of the time, we try and tell them to not look at a DIB. And that is mainly because the reasons for looking at a DIB are very technical and specific. They can deliver a lot of benefits, but most people are not DIB ready. We talk about innovation. DIBs driving innovations because you get flexibility to try and achieve a target. It's not about the how, but the what, which is great. But does not mean that you should be using DIBs to incubate your new idea, right? You need time in the space. You need to have some learning. You need to have some level of credibility and data to be DIB ready. What DIBs can then do is drive innovation in your processes to take it and create some sort of step change. But this is not the place to incubate new ideas. This is also not the place for, I have a model, I know exactly what I need to do, and everyone else knows exactly what to do. Because one of the great benefits of DIBs is to align incentives, but also to allocate risk in the right place. If there is no challenge with risk allocation, then you're really doing a DIB so that you can get on a panel like this and advertise that I've done a DIB, right? Sorry to say that quite bluntly, right? And so I think the key for organizations that are thinking about DIBs is firstly, be data ready. Start to collect a lot of important data, understand your own progress first. So have that time in market. And secondly, identify two things. One is there an innovation gap that would be exciting for me to fill, right? DIB is not the thing that should drive you to just continue bringing your costs down. That should be business as usual. We're not here to solve your management challenges. It's more about saying, actually, I don't have anyone willing to take the risk to identify a new surgical procedure, which I've currently been doing 1,000 times, but I think there's more out there. So that kind of innovation, identify what that is. And secondly, identify what you think is the misallocation of risk. Why is it that the person funding you today is conservative in their funding? If they're not, then a general outcome fund is fine. But if they're being conservative for a particular set of reasons, then a DIB could actually be the answer. So these are the two things. You spot the misallocation of risk, and secondly, identify what is the innovation opportunity, have a belief in that, and then I think there's a conversation.
And for education, let me bring that alive. Usually in education, the funding is focused on the number of children that you're educating as against their learning outcomes. So the innovation in this piece is about bringing that focus onto learning outcomes. So from that, I'm going to move on to Soumya. A month ago, we waited with bated breath to see what Dalberg had been doing over the years. Should we be telling them off? Have they actually performed in the way we wanted them to with our service providers? And Soumya sent us the results. So she's going to start by telling you about the results, and then I'll ask her a few follow-on questions to help bring that alive.
Before I start, I think I like to joke that I'm always in the eye of the storm when it comes to the DIB, and it's been both very challenging and rewarding to be in that whole chaos or newness and innovation of doing this for the first time. I think when we did set up the targets, design the study, and went about defining what we are measuring, of course, as partly research thinkers, we think, oh, this is going to be like, we have 4 providers, they're all going to kind of meet their target right there, and it's going to be clean, at least in the first year. But what turned out was a super achievement in some cases and underachievement in other cases, which was, I think, subject to a lot of different conversation, but that's the thing, right? I think reality plays out so differently from how we predict data will actually happen on the ground. I think the things that were very important to us for the DIB, and just not talking about results, is also there were 3 key questions we approached this from. So one is what to measure, and that was largely clear from the learning outcomes piece because we knew that's what we were measuring. The second piece was slightly trickier. How do we measure accurately and making sure that there is rigor in the data collection process, because at the end we are doing a high-stake assessment here. So I think solving for that was the second challenge we overcame. The third and the most important challenge, and Gaurav easily put it, the targets were very clear. What are we measuring against, right? What are the standards we measure against? How do we set these targets? Now this, I think, was the largest or the biggest trick that we had to come up with for DIB, and a unique one as well. And we did a comparative analysis against schools that were not in the DIB, and I'm not going to talk through the entire study design, and also based it on a lot of past data. So we've been doing this for 5 years, so we've seen how organizations doing certain interventions perform, and then bringing in secondary research data from across the world to set those targets. So and there's this tightrope of balancing the stretch and what is meaningful as a target. You don't want to kind of push them too hard, and where do you keep that balance? So it was a lot of fun conversations and lot many phone calls, and I'm sure again going back to Gagan, I think we've had a lot of interactions, but the outcome of all of that has been that transparency in measurement. I think everyone in the DIB at this point understands, although Abba keeps joking about it, but I think we are all in alignment in what we are measuring, how we are measuring it, and what are we measuring against. And I think that transparency, if I had to say it's something that we have achieved in the first year, it's probably that thing, that there is a common understanding, at least within the DIB, and everyone's bought into that, right? And from just the achievement of the DIB itself, on what we've found, I think Richard did mention it already, we saw that large part of the DIB's impact has happened at the bottom of the class. So children the classes in both cases, the DIB and the non-DIB population, started with about a third of their population not demonstrating skills that were required for them to be in the grade. And at the end of the year, we saw a 30% movement that was higher than what is seen in the non-DIB group, from the below grade level to moving into demonstrating at least some grade level skills. And 40% of the schools had met their targets or exceeded them, which is again phenomenal. And what is again mind-boggling is this is not what we usually see, and there is what we typically refer to as a DIB effect that we are seeing, because the ones that have actually used the data. So that's the second interesting thing we did. We always do, but this time we saw more consumption of that, which is actually taking the data and talking to the service providers. We do a detailed workshop on how they can use that data to make changes in their academic program, right? And we, in the DIB, there was a lot more application of that data. Usually people listen in and walk out, but in the DIB we saw that there was a lot more focus on using the data, and those that were actually focused on using the data have also shown the performance on that side. So I think for me that's big things.
Brilliant. So, Samya, that's a good summary. I'm going to ask you, amongst the many stupid questions I've asked you in the last 2 years, one of the ones I'm sure that in lots of people's minds. There are 4 different models doing totally different things, some of them directly intervening in the classroom, some of them training principals. How do you compare them? And are you measuring them on the same way?
Yeah. So I think before I even start about differences, I think the premise is that if you're investing in education, it has to lead to outcomes, in improvement in learning outcomes, right? It can be big or small, and now that goes back to what Abba is talking about, which is are you intervening directly in a classroom? Like we have a model which actually runs the entire school, so they are in charge of enrolling the students, hire their own teachers, and run the whole program. Now a program like that is supposed to kind of improve learning outcomes at a phenomenal rate, because you're fully in control of the process. But then on the other end, we have another program which is training the leaders or the government administration in terms of better practices of managing government schools. And there, the percolation has to go from the leadership to the teachers to the learning outcomes. It is a much smaller magnitude that you would expect as an improvement, but that has to happen, because otherwise why are you even training it? Now, as I mentioned earlier, what we have done is in the past 5 years, we've measured a lot of different interventions, some of them what we call direct, which is basically in the classroom, very hands-on, and then moving all the way to the spectrum of being very indirect, going to the leaders, to the administrative people in the system and things like that. So we've used that past data, which we ourselves have collected in the Indian context, and saying how much improvement have they been able to show, and then extrapolated and triangulated with secondary research from across the world, from different geographies, not just the Western world, but a lot of developing economies as well, to see what is the demonstrated impact of these programs, and then come up with a target on that.
Great. Another follow-on stupid question. So, Asar put the fact that a child can't read a paragraph, grade 5 child can't read a paragraph in English that is meant to be for a grade 2 child. What are you testing? Give us some examples so that it really makes it, contextualizes it for the crowds. It's not theoretical.
Sure. So I think what we measure is what is taught, right? The measurement always follows the intervention. So we're not doing something completely different or anything. But what we do measure is not memorized knowledge, right? We try to stay away, except for the very early grades where you are learning alphabets, you are learning numbers, and that's just a bare minimum. But as we move up, we're not measuring memorized knowledge. But what we expect the child to is to be able to apply what they are learning into solving a problem. So just looking at one of the questions in the morning has a balance with a cabbage in one and a tomato in the other, and they're showing the cabbage being slightly lower, and we ask, what do you infer from this? That the cabbage is heavier than the tomato is heavier than the cabbage. Now, these are very conceptual learnings that you need to be able to bring in to thinking in the real world terms. So the test design itself takes care of the basic things that they learn, and then they move on to application-oriented questions, and based on how well they're able to apply a concept, right? And there could be simple questions like, can you recognize this letter? And it could have a ABC as well, because that's the fundamental blocks on which you build the learning. When it comes to reading, we have very different ways of approaching reading. Fluency is not one of those, but what we do look at is, as a child able to read a small para or a small story, and look at it at two different angles. One is literally read it and retrieve what is directly stated in that passage. Like, I went to Delhi, where did I go? Delhi, right? But then the second level, which we think again is a very important skill for a future citizen, is critical thinking when you read, to ask questions like, how do you think that person felt in that setting? How would you change the ending of the story? How would you change what is the moral of the story? What did you learn from it? Things like that, which are not directly stated, and which is something that a school system typically does not cater to at this point, but that's pushing the bar. So we started letter recognition, word recognition, simple reading, moving on all the way to critical thinking. And same thing with math. You start with a double-digit addition, 25 plus 32, how much is it? Then move on to doing it with, say, a carryover or a 3-digit addition, and then move into word problems, which kind of moves the mastery of addition as a concept from its basic blocks to its most advanced way of thinking, right?
So I think that's really useful, because sometimes we forget in all this instrument business about what this is about, and it is about this. I also tested my children with her test, and it does work. I have 2 primary school children. Vikas was also on the steering committee with me as primary school children, so we did use them as guinea pigs, so that this made sense to us, and we weren't doing.
Don't disclose any personal identification information on that.
My daughter is
So
if that's your state, you can imagine my daughter.
So you've got to do it, right, if you're working on this. And moving on to MSTF, first question, why learning outcomes matter? What's the big deal? They talked about social change earlier. Yeah. You could be talking about reading a paragraph in English, so what?
Yeah. So as Geeta mentioned, we have been working in this space for almost a decade now. And when we started working in India, I think the first sort of a question which we had was, okay, there's a big problem in India, which is on the learning outcomes. Poor learning outcomes is a big problem, and how do we solve for that? So we started with that, and then we invested in lot for-profits, not-for-profits, worked with the government, and the idea there is just to solve for that problem. Okay, and the reason we chose learning outcomes, because it said that you could focus on inputs or you could focus on outcomes. Okay, now on inputs, when we saw the NGOs we interacted with, there are a lot of NGOs, some are working in teacher training, some are working in remedial education. There are people who are just working on the society. There are people who are working with the parents. But ultimately, and it's probably not the right way to put it, but whatever we are doing, even if we are just doing a music class in a classroom, ultimately these kids, when they go into the real world, they have to be able to compete with people from a middle income or a high income background. They should be able to compete when they are interviewing for a particular job or going for a college. So in a way, it has to impact for life outcomes. So I'm saying more than a learning outcome for us, it was like life outcomes. Ultimately, you are working to change life outcome for these kids. And for that life outcome, what is that intermediate measure when you are in that primary sort of a school environment, and the private school environment it was learning outcome. So a kid, if he is in a grade 1, he should learn what he's supposed to learn in grade 1, because then only he'll be able to compete with somebody from a premium school. So with that idea in mind, we said, okay, let's look at the program which are working. Now, when we looked at the program, now how do we know those programs are working? So we said, okay, we have to measure, and we have to define that measurement framework. And that's why Somya, EI, like we worked with a lot of other organizations to create that measurement framework. Again, it was again around learning outcome, it was again grade level outcome. And as you mentioned, like sir has a different way of measuring. And we said that just having basic literacy and numeracy skill, while it is important, because when you are starting for a low base, that's the first thing you want to target. But ultimately to change their life outcome, you need to get to them to the level where they should be. And that's how the measurement framework was developed. Now, when you start getting data, I think the good thing with the data is like you could do a lot of things with it. Like the first thing which led to is the accountability and transparency. Like so, we started holding the NGOs which we are working with accountable to those data. It become a bit more transparent discussion where we are saying, okay, your renewal are dependent on whether you're delivering outcomes. As long as you're showing movement toward those outcomes, it would work. I think over a period, the second thing which is led to also, and Geeta was also mentioning about the impact, that is that you could also use that data to incentivize people, right? So, and that's how the impact linked debt we started working on. Now, given all of these sort of 4 parameters which we are working on, I think DIB actually sort of combined all of those 4 together, right? And that's the reason why we got so interested in DIB. Like you could actually structure and institutionalize the transparency, accountability, incentivization, efficiency, and the measurement, and basically create a tool which is driving ultimately the learning outcome.
Brilliant. So they are really, really interesting. They look at life chances, they turn it into something that's measurable, they invest in data, then they work in partnership to make sure it becomes sort of a little bit more mainstream, which is what perhaps the rest of us are. But that front-running role, so it's great. That sounds great in principle. Very forward-thinking when you do it internally at MSDF. You're just a bunch of you there. I mean, God, the whole wide world working on a DIB. Sometimes we fought hard, especially Dhan's here. I'll get a Dhan perspective in a minute. So what's it like to work in a consortium? Would you recommend it, Vikas?
No, I wouldn't. No, if you have enough dollars, like then you just work like BMGF and just spend your money and do everything. No, I think when we were doing all of this, like and we always thought like there is 2 ways to work on it. Like one is you scale your intervention, okay. Other is you scale your approach. So we thought, and we always think about that, we have to scale our approach. Like if we have worked and with a GMI or EI to create a measurement tools, that's not for internal consumption, like that is for ecosystem. So we have to scale that measurement approach to ecosystem. So similarly, when we are talking about all this transparency, incentivization, the idea was how do you scale it to the ecosystem itself? Like that's the only way it could be sustainable. Like,
But you bear the scars, right?
No, I don't think so. I would say it's always interesting to get people coming, right? Like there are obviously all the people would have different incentives. They are coming from different worlds. But I think as long as you can combine and you can work together, like, and if in any case if you're talking about solving a problem in education, like I think all of us sitting here still have that common mission, still can understand. Like you just think of the whole stakeholder which is involved in this education system. Like there's a government department, and in the government department also there are a variety of divisions there. Then there is a diet, there is a school principal, there is a school teacher, and then there are the kids and the parents. So I think the number of stakeholders who are involved in those systems, so you have to anyway collaborate. And if we can't collaborate between us, I think then we should forget about solving this problem.
So, so he says that, but I'll be honest, more honest than he's being. It is hard. Everybody does come from a different place. Internal systems work differently. We have different incentives as organizations. I've got Tata Trust here. There's Dhan who represents the investors. I was the British Asian Trust. Vikas was sitting in India. We did come at it differently. But what I think helped us work together when everything was starting to come apart in certain ways was the fact that we focused on one single outcome. And it helps. That's what helps. The fact that you can go back to first principles and say, what is the problem we're trying to solve? How are we trying to solve it? And then you start undoing things. And then I'm going to move on to Dhan. Dhan, who does represent UBS Optimus. I have huge respect for you. Do you want to talk about what motivates you to do so many DIBs and in India as well?
Yeah, so maybe a little bit about the UBS Optimus Foundation and actually, our role as risk investor. I must say that UBS Optimus Foundation is a charitable foundation, and the way we have come at least initial DIBs that we've been involved with has been really to kind of push the agenda and challenge assumptions and the status quo on transparency and accountability and an outcomes focus in the sector. And we've been funding programs globally. We've funded programs across 40 countries for the past 20 years. In India, we've been funding for over 15 years. A lot of the experiences that we've had have really kind of led us to constantly assessing this question of how do you bring the results to the actual center of development programming. And so for us as a charitable foundation, but with the unique position of having access to one of the world's leading financial institutions, it became a very interesting space to start exploring and experimenting with innovative finance. And can we use financing to actually incentivize and drive social impact in the sector? So for us, what we're kind of really the trick that we're trying to really address or solve here is how do we get that new funding into the sector that we've all been talking about to address this SDG funding gap? And for us, we actually see that wall of money that people are referring to. We actually see that opportunity amongst clients within the bank and amongst high net worth individuals and philanthropists globally. One of our findings in terms of the sort of ultra high net worth and high net worth segment has been that more than 90% of individuals are philanthropically active, but less than 20% of them are satisfied with their philanthropy. That means that they are likely to not continue giving, they're likely to be holding back on the amount that they're giving, and they will never explore going beyond their philanthropic pool of funding to maybe tapping into their private pot of funding. So we need to really fix this accountability and impact question. Is development funding really leading to results? And so for us, that's been the key motivation and driver for coming in as risk investor on all three of the DIBs in India, the Utkrishт, the first DIB that we funded, the Educate Girls, and now the Quality Education India DIB.
Brilliant. I have a fair few questions, but I'm aware there are lots of people in the audience who might have questions. I'm going to stop with the panel discussion for now. And I've spoken to my fellow panelists. As we're all focused on results-based financing, questions have to be short. And as the British Asian Trust is a partner for the English Cricket Board and my chief exec's in the room, the shorter the question, you get 2 tickets to the semi-finals. So focus on short questions. Keep it interesting for the rest of the audience. And make sure the panel can contribute. And my chief exec will cough up 2 tickets for the semi-finals. So that's the challenge to you. Short questions, interesting questions. You've got a great panel. Get them to think with you, challenge us. No PhD thesis at questions, please. Over to you guys. And I'll take 2 or 3 at a time so we can get people to prepare.
Hi, I'm Saurav from the Balipara Foundation, and my question is a broad-based question to outcomes and the definition of an outcome. So I think it's great that we've switched from thinking about inputs to thinking about outcomes. But every sort of outcome or like accumulation of outcomes have long-standing impacts, right? So learning outcomes are great, but like learning outcomes translate to say employability, which is like a long-term impact. So is there a way in which you, I mean, I know that you have a lot on your plate anyway, but is there a way in which you have thought about making this transition from outcome to impact? And will this sort of be able to ever merge with the fastest way of returns on investment? You know, so I don't know if that'll ever work, but like, what are your thoughts on it? And especially, I think and UBS, that'll be great. Thanks.
There's another one there.
Hi, I'm Pankaj from Transform Schools. So thank you so much for a lovely, lively conversation. My question is really short. So great, impact bond process. Then what? How do you see that journey after that for your own self and for the participating organizations?
Clearly the incentives are working. You can see how we do this in our real-time job, right?
Hi, my name is Amit. I run the India consortium for the Global Fund to End Modern Slavery. We've been trying to do the whole DIB conversation in the philanthropy CSR space for a while, and one of the questions that comes up often is, in addition to establishing causality for, let's say, educate girls to be able to deliver better educational outcomes, and so the same thing applies to Pankaj and the same thing applies to Aditya, is there causality for DIB having worked in increasing educational outcomes? So for example, let me rephrase. If Safina were to do the same thing without a DIB versus Safina doing the same thing with a DIB, is there something being measured around those lines? Thank you.
Yeah, that's great 3 questions. I'm going to start with the outcome impact piece with Dhan when I quickly think of an answer. We can do what next from 3 of us at least, from Dhan, myself and Vikas. And then the last question is definitely a Gaurav question because he's been thinking about it. Do you want to start, Dhan?
Yeah, sure. I'll actually address both the what next as well as the outcomes outcomes impact and sort of how that unlocks financing or what that means for risk investors. So, in terms of what next, again, and as I mentioned, we've been actually in the unique position of being a social investor. There are a number of terms that we use in this space, but the way I define that is that for us, the objective, and this is specifically for UBS Optimus Foundation, has been maximizing impact. We are very much firmly within the philanthropic side of the sort of philanthropy to investing spectrum. And so that has also given us the luxury to be able to test different models but also presents us with a challenge of, if we really want to achieve our objective of unlocking that new capital that we see the opportunity to do, how do we actually get this risk to return to impact equation right? One of the initiatives that we are working on at the moment is a $100 million DIB investment fund, where we are looking at including about 15 to 20 individual DIBs and actually allowing for a capital stack that provides opportunities for different investors with different profiles to come in and sort of take different risk return tiers in that structure. So the idea is creating room for philanthropic funding to come in along with commercial investment and impact investment. And we do believe that the learning and insight that has been gained from initial DIBs that we've been involved with is critical in helping us to build larger scale DIBs like that. The other question is scale. So in order to really unlock that private side of funding, again, scaled models are ones that actually then offer more opportunity for returns that are interesting enough and attractive enough to unlock some commercial element. And so speaking of the sort of knowledge piece, another one of our initiatives is, and what's next, it's been ongoing, and it's a large piece of work, but that we are doing along with DFID, is supporting the Impact Bond Working Group, where we're actually looking to develop a knowledge platform on impact bonds that are out there, create an accelerator program to actually influence the quality and quantity of DIBs, making sure that folks aren't getting into DIBs when they are not relevant. And there certainly are programs where they are relevant, and certainly programming where it's not the best tool to use. And finally, looking then also at pooling funding for impact bonds. So that's a little bit of what's coming next.
Great, so they are again leading the space, and we're also partners in that impact bond working group, several of us are. So just answering the question about definition, moving to impact, it's a really hard one. We've just about made the journey these guys have been doing for 10 years, pushing the boundaries. It is a difficult one. I don't have a direct answer for you and I will not lie, but it is the one which I would be passionate to try and make. So the way we've tried to square the circle at BAT, after many discussions with my colleague Aditi who's here, is that we looked at women's empowerment more widely and said, right, let's tackle that and let's use proxy indicators to start building that conversation, but not easy as yet. So very early stage, so I can't say. What's next for us are three things. We joined the conversation on scale, really building outcomes funds to unlock money. Government participation, enabling government to see that this is a more efficient way to spend money, and perhaps we can use this way to show them the efficiency of dollars spent, and perhaps they don't have to change their entire program, but the learnings from this can translate into that. We're committed to that. Actually, I'll add two more. The third one is NGO readiness. We really are focused on looking at how not-for-profits can be DIB ready instead of having to get into DIBs and then have to try it. Not everybody is ready. The stat I use all the time is Dalberg looked at 400 NGOs for us when they did the research for this DIB. Only 10 were ready to measure on outcomes, and only 4 actually put their hands up and worked with us. That means the sector is not ready and we have to do a lot more work. And finally, the commitment we have as the British Asian Trust to the diaspora to make them an agent of social change in India, a committed agent to good work in partnership with India, not sitting separately. So that's from our end. Vikas?
So I think the first question on how do we make that shift from learning outcome to employability, I think it's difficult to do in a structure like DIB because these are sort of a finite timeline. So it's a 4-year instrument, and it's a primary focus on primary outcomes. But in some of our other work, like when we are working with the government and when we are talking about systemic change in the education system itself, there we are thinking of that questions, the learning outcomes is just one measurement. Ultimately, as I said, that for us the important thing is life outcomes. How do you change life outcome for these kids? So again, there are a lot of factors, there's the economic growth of the country itself which generates that employment, and it's very difficult for a funder like us to really impact that. But what you could do is you could just enable everybody to have an equal shot at that employment opportunities. And how do you do it? And as GMI and all of us have a framework saying, okay, when we are measuring learning outcome, it's just one measurement saying, okay, this is the delta or this is the grade level outcomes. But then there's also a distribution of those kids, then how do you get kids in the higher sort of a distribution, higher competencies level, and how do you sustain those higher competency level, when you're starting from grade 1 till grade 12, how do you sustain and what percentage of kid has to be sustained in those level? And depending on where you end up with, you could have different paths, there is a college path, and then you make sure that they get a good shot at college education. And similarly with the employment, that you start building some of those other technical skills like the coding or the life skills, so some of those also get embedded in the system. So all of those we are working in our systemic transformation projects. But it's very difficult to do in a DIB sort of an instrument because you need to have one very definite outcomes which is easier to communicate and easier to measure, and that's why you end up doing a learning outcome. But let's say if it is a skill DIB, it would just focus on employability or placement, you could do that also.
The causality question is a great question.
Yeah, for transparency, I sit on the board of Educate Go, so I'm going to tell you what Safina was going through and why actually the big story on DIB is the non-DIB impacts, right? So this is what Safina will tell you. She will say, I was running a very successful NGO that was starting to gain some attention, but suddenly I was forced to really become data-orientated. That and just to put it in context, that original DIB was for a few thousand girls at a time when she was working with a few 100,000. So those few thousand girls that she was looking at for the DIB forced her to change the way she was looking at the few 100,000. She had to become intensely data-orientated. She built a skill set in-house to deal with that. She suddenly had performance teams running around to see how could they uplift performance as part of the DIB. And then she took it across the rest of her organization. When she took it across the rest of her organization, she was able to go out to public and say, here is what I can do. And what she learned, and it's something that I know Gagan has learned and helped as part of the performance management on this DIB, is that often it's the 20% of activity that's leading to 80% of the outcome. She found it's the 20% of villages that are leading to 80% of the actual outcomes. So with a bit of machine learning, she took that to audacious and said, I can take over 33% of the total Indian target for putting girls back into school. Incredibly audacious. She just got $30 million for that. And she will tell you it's because of the DIB. Okay? So in a sort of a small setting, I think what's happening overall, which is, look, DIBs are not the mainstream instrument, but they are driving some of the mainstream discussions around what does it mean to be disciplined, how to bring performance and measurement into this space. And again, I would again say that if you really look at the concept of what is impact, the most honest conversation on impact is happening inside a development impact bond, because it's the only place where you're not printing your own definition. This whole collaboration has to agree, right? And an outcome funder has everything to lose with a shallow definition. They're not going to give you money. It's the discipline that sits inside, and I think that can influence the broader conversation, which is mediocre at best right now, right, in terms of its definition. So I think it's that, and then I think more broadly this conversation that all of you have been having, the first panel is having, around measuring. Again, I think the DIB has contributed significantly. So I would say the overall impact is quite outsized. What we're very excited about is, with some organizations, there's a natural exit for them, for their own, they build a capability for continuous improvement, that's great. And for others, they're going to identify that there is huge amounts of money that can be unlocked because suddenly they've proven something, and so now they can show how to allocate risk better, and that to me is government. For government to start looking at some of this stuff and to say, okay, I know I can't take any risk. It's a big challenge, I just literally can't take any risk. But these instruments are showing to me that there's something here where riskless, I can pull my money into this. And I think that's the exit that we're all really excited about.
Absolutely. I'm going to have 3 last questions. It's 2 o'clock. We're keeping you away from your food, so I'm just away. And the same rules still apply. Outcomes don't change and we don't print our currency out.
Sure. Thanks, Abha. My name's Aparna. I'm with Asha Impact. I'll keep it really short. I think this came up in the previous panel as well about innovation, and there's criticism and as well as listed as a benefit of DIBs as well, that they aspire more innovation in the way NGOs are looking at tackling the same problem. So just wanted to hear the panel's view on that. Like, how did you guys go about selecting the 4 models? And of course, they're doing fantastic work on ground. But was that at one of the core metrics on which you selected them as well? And how is maybe Dalberg or some of the other outcome funders or risk investors pushing them to kind of rethink their own processes?
Any more questions to?
I have one more question in case you can allow me.
Go on, Amit.
So the other question, I don't know if you can hear.
Thank you. The other question is a more, I think, what I would categorize a more technical one. My understanding so far, and feel free to correct me, is that for the outcome fund and for the risk investor in a DIB structure, either both of them need to exist in India or both of them need to exist outside of India. I think the real technical challenge so far for the DIB market has been that monies, philanthropic monies from India cannot go outside of India. Is there any piece of policy that we are looking at to address this? Because otherwise we'll always be restricted by this conundrum. Thank you.
Great. One final question. Are we done? Brilliant. People are hungry, clearly. I'm looking at the selection one at Vikas. I'll add a few things on that, but.
No, as we mentioned earlier, like this, and Abha said that 400 went to 10 and to 4, right? So there was, these are the organizations which were already had measurement at least going, right? So these are organizations who have already gone through some assessments. There is some track record of performance. So in a way, we started with that. But then there were these almost 8 to 10 organizations, right, which had all of that going for them. I think on top of that, it was just flexibility and adaptability of those organizations. Like when we are talking about processes changes, when we're talking about using data to do decision making, like this is a lot of organizations who were collecting data around outcomes, but that wasn't driving their decision making, or that was not driving their processes to the extent you would want. Like if you think of a traditional grant structure, like, and we have done grant to all of these organizations and work with them. In a traditional grant structure, you are typically funding 20 to 30% of their project cost. Even when you are driving that, there are other funders, 70%, who you typically would not even end talking with, like, so you are not on a common ground. And when Abha was saying about this whole coalition, at the very least, all of us are sitting together and having those discussions around those common outcomes. So I think DIB just allows them to create, to innovate on that. And I think when we were selecting, we were just looking at the people who are flexible enough to innovate. Like, as long as you are flexible enough to listen, flexible enough to innovate, and flexible enough to then implement, I think those sort of an organization would work better in a DIB structure, and that's what we went with.
I'll add another layer. So that was the layer at the NGO layer. But as a consortium, we wanted variety. We wanted different sorts of inputs so we could measure against the same target. Yeah. So we looked around to find a variety of inputs so that they could actually be cross-compared to say, if a child is being taught directly by a teacher after school versus a principal training model, can you actually compare them on a level playing field? So we did broad-base that, and the DELs actually, of course, had huge data to help us do that.
Could I just add one thought on this?
You were part of that as well, yes.
Yeah, no, actually, it's more a message to you guys. This is the DIB is, as we talked about, is a free market mechanism that's coming in. Now, the question is, have we all actually embraced free market mentality, right? Donors are used to funding some of these guys directly, and it's a nice relationship. And, you're not performing, let me help you out. That's not how it works in a DIB. You're not performing, bye, right? That's the power of it. And there are good reasons to go directly and give grants and work with organizations. That's a different market. This is a hard-edged market. I don't think we've all made that mental shift. And I would say part of how you select organizations is you should be selecting organizations that can take it as well. So you select an organization that goes into your DIB and tomorrow you say, sorry, you underperformed, and you're going to destroy that organization as a result, then, it's not going to happen, right? When no one in the sector is willing to take that kind of call. So that would be the thing that we don't really talk about is you should be willing to take on organizations that aren't looking at DIBs for their survival as well.
And just on the innovation question, I think it's the fundamental structure of the DIB that drives the innovation. It's not, it's not any one of the partners that is doing anything specifically, or it's not a question of how we are driving innovation in those organizations, but the rigor that the DIB brings to, with the fact that funding is finally linked to delivery of outcomes, gets them thinking, and that's what really drives the innovation angle.
Yeah, and you can have process innovation, which is different from absolute innovation, and I think what Diffit talk about very well is that there's the big bet answers. You can get 60% right and do it at scale, as against looking at 100% perfection piece, which I think there is a way of thinking about that as well, which also sits within this. The last question on regulation, my goodness, who's going to take that one? Go on.
I was throwing my hands up as in who knows, but it's a great question, I would say.
Yeah, no, so we did evaluate it, like when we were structuring this DIB initially, we did evaluate all the structures, saying, okay, can we create a structure in India? But then there are FCRA regulation, which doesn't allow you to do it. Again, as you said, that Indian money can't go outside and then come inside, the rotation can't happen. So I would say there are a lot of moving pieces for it to really work in India. I think if you want, if everything has to come, like foreign funding and local funding, all of it has to come into a common fund, then obviously there has to be changes in the way FCRA is structured. Again, from a local funding, if you're just talking about foundation, but there's only limited amount of money, the bigger dollars are CSR, for CSR, if it has to, then you have to change the CSR law altogether, because the CSR law is on fixed spend, versus here it is outcome based, and you may or may not spend in that particular year. So how do you take care, because they have to create a certificate and spend in that particular year. So I think there are a lot of changes which needs to be done. I think there are the people who are trying to work with the government to make some of those changes. People are also trying to figure out some alternate structure using AIF and all, but I would say everything end up going into a grey area right now. It's not very clear as per the regulation, but yeah, if government tomorrow, and I think one sort of advocacy piece could be how do you even change the regulatory structure on some of this impact bond to enable a lot more innovation in India, a lot more instrument coming to India.
Great, with that I'm going to end, let you have your lunch. Should I award that, should I get Pankaj to get that ticket? I think the shortest question, so thank you very much everyone.